At dawn on December 7, 1941, Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft struck the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. In Washington, military planners scrambled to understand what had just happened. In Tokyo, Japanese commanders believed they already knew the answer. They had studied the Americans for years. They had analyzed American culture, American military capability, American psychology. And they had reached a conclusion that would shape their entire strategy in the Pacific War. The Americans, they believed, could not fight. Not really. Not when it mattered. They had ships and factories and vast industrial resources, but they lacked the one quality that actually won wars. They lacked warrior spirit. In less than 8 months, that belief would be tested in the jungles of a remote island called Guadalcanal. The results would shatter everything Japanese military doctrine had promised. This is the story of how cultural arrogance led an empire to catastrophic miscalculation, and how a generation of American Marines proved that courage cannot be measured by mythology. To understand what happened in the Solomon Islands in 1942, you must first understand what Japanese officers believed about themselves. For decades, the Imperial Japanese military had built its doctrine on a concept called Seishin Kyoiku, spiritual education. This was more than simple morale training. It was a systematic indoctrination that taught Japanese soldiers they possessed an inherent spiritual advantage over any enemy they might face. The concept had roots in Japan's ancient warrior traditions. The samurai had believed that perfect mental discipline could overcome any physical obstacle. A man who embraced death, who freed himself from fear of mortality, became unstoppable. Modern Japanese military theorists had adapted this philosophy, arguing that Japan's unique cultural heritage produced soldiers with unmatched fighting spirit. Western nations, they argued, had grown soft through materialism and individualism. Their soldiers fought for pay, for personal glory, for abstract political concepts. Japanese soldiers fought for the emperor, a living god descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. They fought for a sacred mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. They fought with the certain knowledge that death in battle guaranteed eternal honor. This belief system had been reinforced by Japan's stunning victory over Russia in 1905. The Russo-Japanese War had pitted a modernizing Asian nation against a major European power, and Japan had won. At the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese fleet had annihilated a Russian armada that had sailed halfway around the world. On land, Japanese infantry had stormed Russian fortifications with a determination that shocked Western military observers. The lesson seemed clear. Superior fighting spirit could overcome technological and numerical disadvantages. Will could defeat weapons. Spirit could triumph over steel. By the 1930s, this philosophy dominated Japanese military thinking. Officers were taught that one Japanese soldier was worth 5 or 10 enemy troops. Not because Japanese training was superior, not because Japanese equipment was better, but because Japanese spirit was unbreakable. When Japan launched its conquest of China in 1937, early victories seemed to validate this worldview. Chinese armies collapsed despite having more men, more territory, more resources. Japanese commanders concluded that their theories were correct. Spiritual superiority was a real, measurable military advantage. Then came Pearl Harbor, and the cascade of victories that followed. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces surrendered by the tens of thousands. The fortress of Corregidor, which was supposed to hold for months, fell in weeks. General Douglas MacArthur fled to Australia, leaving behind over 70,000 prisoners. In British Malaya, Japanese forces advanced down the peninsula with shocking speed. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered after barely 2 weeks of siege. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. Over 80,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war. In the Dutch East Indies, in Hong Kong, in Burma, the pattern repeated. Colonial armies that had maintained order for generations melted away when confronted by Japanese determination. Western commanders, accustomed to enemies who would surrender when the situation became hopeless, found themselves facing soldiers who seemed to welcome death. Japanese intelligence officers compiled reports from these campaigns and drew what seemed like obvious conclusions. Western soldiers, particularly Americans, were exactly as predicted. They were products of a decadent culture that valued personal comfort over collective sacrifice. They would fight competently when they held overwhelming advantages, but they would not stand and die when the situation turned desperate. They would surrender. They would retreat. They would break. This assessment extended specifically to the United States Marine Corps. Japanese intelligence had studied the Marines with particular interest, since it was clear they would be the spearhead of any American counteroffensive across the Pacific. What they found seemed to confirm their assumptions. The Marine Corps was a small service, numbering fewer than 70,000 men when war began. It had spent the interwar years fighting small colonial wars in Central America and the Caribbean. Its most recent significant combat experience had been in the First World War, more than 2 decades earlier. It had no experience with modern jungle warfare. Its equipment was often hand-me-downs from the army. In the assessment of Japanese military intelligence, the Marines were garrison troops, good enough for police actions against poorly armed guerrillas but untested against a first-rate military power. When Wake Island fell in December 1941 after a 2-week siege, Japanese commanders noted the Marine defenders had fought stubbornly. But Wake had been a tiny garrison with nowhere to run. Trapped men will fight desperately. The question was what would happen when Marines faced Japanese forces in a less constrained environment. Would they maintain discipline? Would they stand and fight when they could retreat? Or would they behave like the other Western forces Japan had already defeated, collapsing once they realized Japanese soldiers would not stop coming? By mid-1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted. American carrier victories at Coral Sea and Midway had blunted Japanese naval expansion. American codebreakers had learned that Japan was building an airfield on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. An operational airfield there would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, ordered an immediate counteroffensive. The job fell to Major General Alexander Vandegrift and his 1st Marine Division. Vandegrift was 54 years old, a career officer who had served in the Caribbean and China. He was methodical, unflappable, and deeply respected by his men. He was also pessimistic about his division's readiness. He had been promised 6 months to train his men for combat. He got 3 weeks. The division was scattered across multiple bases in the Pacific. Equipment was still being loaded and sorted in New Zealand. There was no time for proper rehearsals. When the division practiced an amphibious landing in Fiji, the operation descended into chaos. Boats landed in the wrong places. Units became separated. Equipment was lost. Officers later called it a complete disaster. And yet, time had run out. The invasion of Guadalcanal, codenamed Operation Watchtower, would proceed with whatever preparation they could manage. Vandegrift's Marines were a mixture of pre-war regulars and recent enlistees. Many had joined after Pearl Harbor, driven by rage at the Japanese attack. They had minimal jungle training. They did not understand the diseases that awaited them. They had never faced an enemy who preferred death to surrender. But they were Marines, and they believed in their own readiness even if their commander had doubts. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal and the nearby islands. They achieved complete surprise. The Japanese construction workers and small garrison force fled into the jungle without offering meaningful resistance. By nightfall, the Marines had secured their primary objective, an unfinished airfield that would be renamed Henderson Field after a Marine aviator killed at Midway. The landing had been easier than anyone expected. But the Marines were about to learn that seizing an island was simpler than holding it. On the night of August 8, a Japanese cruiser force surprised the Allied naval screen at the Battle of Savo Island. 4 Allied cruisers were sunk in less than an hour. Over 1,000 sailors died. It was one of the worst naval defeats in American history. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, fearing further losses to his precious aircraft carriers, ordered the fleet to withdraw. The carriers left. The supply ships left. Most of the marine supplies and equipment that had not yet been unloaded left. Vandegrift's division was stranded. The Marines were bitter about the abandonment. Decades later, veterans would still speak of Fletcher's withdrawal with barely controlled fury. One commemorative medal privately minted showed an admiral's hand dropping a hot potato into a Marine's arms, with the inscription Faciat Georgius, let George do it. Now the Marines faced a grim reality. They held an airfield, but they had limited ammunition, limited food, and no naval support. Half their supplies were still aboard ships that had sailed away. They had no heavy equipment. No reinforcements were coming. They were alone on an island where Japanese forces were already preparing to counterattack. In Rabaul, Japanese commanders received reports that American forces had landed on Guadalcanal. The initial reaction was not alarm but dismissal. Intelligence estimated perhaps 2,000 Marines had come ashore, a token garrison that would be easily dislodged. The 8th Fleet assigned a regimental-sized force to handle the problem. The man chosen to lead the counterattack was Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki, commander of the 28th Infantry Regiment. Ichiki's unit was among Japan's elite forces, originally designated to assault Midway Island until the naval defeat there cancelled that operation. These were men who had trained extensively for amphibious assaults. They were confident, experienced, and supremely assured of their superiority over American troops. Ichiki received orders to land on Guadalcanal and wait for the rest of his regiment before attacking. He chose to ignore those orders. Waiting suggested he needed help. His first echelon of 900 men would be more than sufficient to crush whatever American forces remained on the island. The Marines, he believed, would collapse at the first determined assault. Japanese military doctrine had predicted it. Early war victories had confirmed it. There was no reason to wait. What Ichiki did not know was that the Marines were expecting him. A coast watcher named Jacob Vuza, a sergeant major in the British Solomon Islands Police, had been gathering intelligence on Japanese movements. Japanese soldiers captured him and found an American flag hidden in his clothing. They demanded information about Marine positions. Vuza refused to speak. The Japanese tied him to a tree and used him for bayonet practice. They stabbed him 7 times, piercing his arms, throat, shoulder, face, chest, and abdomen. They left him to die. Vuza did not die. When the Japanese moved on, he chewed through his ropes using his teeth. Bleeding from multiple wounds, he crawled through miles of jungle to reach the Marine lines. He arrived just before Ichiki's assault and warned Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock that Japanese forces were approaching from the east. Pollock immediately reinforced his positions along a creek the Americans called the Tenaru River. Machine gun crews registered their fields of fire. Artillery batteries calculated coordinates. When the Japanese attacked, the Marines would be ready. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on August 21, Ichiki launched his assault. Japanese soldiers charged across a sandbar at the mouth of the creek, screaming battle cries, bayonets fixed. This was the moment when American troops were supposed to break. This was when their lack of warrior spirit was supposed to reveal itself. Japanese doctrine predicted that Western soldiers could not withstand the psychological pressure of a banzai charge. Their morale would shatter. They would flee. What happened next shocked the Japanese who survived. The Marines did not run. They did not panic. They did not surrender. They held their positions and opened fire with devastating accuracy. Machine guns swept the sandbar. Artillery shells exploded among the assault waves. The water-cooled .30 caliber guns, manned by Marines who had trained extensively with the weapons, cut through the attackers with mechanical precision. Japanese soldiers fell by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The sandbar became a killing ground. Ichiki had expected the Americans to break when they saw Japanese soldiers charging with fixed bayonets. This was what always happened. Western troops could not match Japanese determination. But the Marines did not break. One Marine machine gunner, Private Albert Schmid, was wounded early when a grenade exploded near his position. Shrapnel struck his face, destroying both his eyes. Blinded, he continued to operate his weapon by touch alone, guided by his assistant gunner who called out targets. He remained at his post until dawn. As the sun rose, the Japanese attack had failed completely. Ichiki's men had achieved nothing except their own destruction. But the battle was not over. Vandegrift ordered a counterattack. Marines crossed the creek upstream and swung around to encircle the surviving Japanese. Light tanks joined the assault, M3 Stuart tanks that Marines called their iron cavalry. The encirclement was methodical and brutal. Japanese soldiers who had survived the night found themselves trapped with Marines closing in from all sides. Some tried to swim to safety and were shot in the water. Some fought to the last bullet and then charged with bayonets. Some committed suicide rather than face capture. The tanks rolled through the coconut grove, crushing wounded Japanese soldiers beneath their treads. The Marines who followed showed no more mercy than the Japanese had shown in their conquests across Asia. By late afternoon, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of Ichiki's 900 men, approximately 800 were dead. Perhaps 128 escaped into the jungle. Marine casualties were 35 killed and 75 wounded. The exchange rate was staggering. For every American who fell, more than 7 Japanese soldiers died. This was not supposed to happen. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture, a profound disgrace in Japanese military culture. He then either died fighting or committed ritual suicide. The exact circumstances remain uncertain. What is certain is that he did not survive to explain why his assault had failed so catastrophically. When news reached Rabaul, Japanese commanders reacted with disbelief. The reports had to be wrong. A Japanese infantry regiment could not have been annihilated by American Marines. This was simply impossible. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had the same reaction. The defeat was so unexpected that many officers refused to believe it. Something must have gone wrong with Ichiki's plan. Perhaps the terrain had been worse than anticipated. Perhaps the Marines had received unexpected reinforcements. The Marines themselves could not have been the problem. This denial had fatal consequences. Instead of reassessing their assumptions about American fighting capability, Japanese commanders concluded that Ichiki had simply sent too few men. The solution was obvious. Send more. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi received command of the next attempt. He would lead approximately 6,000 men from the 35th Infantry Brigade, veterans who had fought successfully in Borneo and the Philippines. Kawaguchi was more thoughtful than Ichiki. He studied reports from the Tenaru carefully. He understood the Marines were better prepared than expected. He planned to march his men through the jungle to attack from the south, where Marine defenses were lighter. A ridge running toward Henderson Field provided a natural avenue of approach. If his men could seize that ridge in a surprise night attack, they could overrun the airfield before the Marines could react. The ridge had no name in September 1942. After the battle, it would be called Bloody Ridge. Kawaguchi's march through the jungle was far more difficult than anticipated. His men struggled through terrain that seemed designed to destroy military formations. Trails disappeared. Units became separated. Supplies ran out. Soldiers arrived at their assault positions exhausted, hungry, and disorganized. Despite these problems, Kawaguchi remained confident. Japanese fighting spirit would overcome any obstacle. The Marines would surrender once breakthrough was achieved. On the night of September 12, Kawaguchi launched his assault. Defending the ridge was a force of about 800 Marines, primarily from Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion. These were specialists in close combat and irregular warfare. Edson, nicknamed Red Mike for his red hair, had fought guerrillas in Nicaragua and earned a reputation as one of the most aggressive commanders in the Marine Corps. His men both feared and respected him. The Japanese attacked in waves, screaming battle cries, throwing themselves against Marine positions with fanatical determination. The jungle erupted in gunfire. Flares illuminated attacking formations. And again, the Marines did not break. Japanese soldiers breached the lines multiple times. At one point, they came within a few hundred yards of Henderson Field. The outcome hung in balance for hours. If the ridge fell, the airfield would be lost. But the Marines held. Edson personally rallied his men during the crisis, moving along the line under fire, directing counterattacks. When Marines began falling back, Edson stood in the open and shouted. "The ridge," he told them. "This is the ridge. Hold it." Artillery fire devastated Japanese assault waves. The coordination between infantry and artillery was critical. When ammunition ran low, Marines fought with bayonets and rifle butts. By dawn on September 14, Kawaguchi's attack had failed. More than 600 of his men lay dead. The survivors retreated into the jungle to begin a nightmare march westward. The defeats of Ichiki and Kawaguchi should have forced fundamental reassessment. They did not. Japanese commanders escalated their commitment while refusing to acknowledge what the battles had revealed. The problem was systemic. Japanese military culture did not encourage honest reporting of failure. Officers who admitted their plans had failed risked disgrace. It was easier to blame circumstances than confront the possibility that assumptions were wrong. So instead of recognizing Marines were more capable than expected, commanders concluded they simply needed more men. This time would be different. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, arrived on Guadalcanal in October to personally oversee the next offensive. He brought the 2nd Sendai Division, one of the most illustrious units in the Imperial Army. This time there would be no half measures. Over 20,000 troops would participate in coordinated assaults from multiple directions. Hyakutake was so confident his staff prepared plans for accepting the American surrender. There was no doubt in anyone's mind the Marines would be destroyed. The battle began on the night of October 23. Japanese attacks came from multiple directions. Tanks advanced in darkness. Infantry followed in waves. The main assault came from the south, where the Sendai Division was supposed to achieve decisive breakthrough. At one section of that line, Sergeant John Basilone commanded 2 sections of heavy machine guns. Basilone was known as Manila John because he had served in the army in the Philippines before joining the Marines. He was 25 years old, born in Buffalo, raised in New Jersey, the 6th of 10 children in an Italian-American family. He was acknowledged as one of the outstanding experts on the .30 caliber machine gun in the Marine Corps. Throughout the night of October 24 and 25, his position was attacked by approximately 3,000 soldiers from the Sendai Division. The results were catastrophic for Japan. Basilone fought without sleep, without food, without rest. When ammunition ran low, he fought through enemy territory to bring back more, carrying 90 pounds across 200 yards of ground swept by Japanese fire. When gun crews were killed, he manned weapons himself. When guns jammed from continuous firing, he repaired them under fire, burning his hands on superheated barrels. At one point, enemy bodies piled so high they blocked his field of fire. Marines had to leave their positions to push corpses aside so they could continue shooting. Private First Class Nash Phillips, who lost a hand during the battle, later described Basilone visiting the medical tent. He was barefooted and his eyes were red as fire. His face was dirty black from gunfire and lack of sleep. He had a .45 pistol tucked into his waistband. He had just dropped by to see how I was making out. I will never forget him. He will never be dead in my mind. By dawn, only Basilone and 2 other Marines from his section remained standing. The ground was carpeted with Japanese dead. Similar scenes played out across the perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller held his battalion against repeated attacks. After the battle, Puller interrogated a Japanese prisoner. He asked why the attackers had not changed tactics when they saw they were not breaking the Marine line. The prisoner's response revealed everything. "That is not the Japanese way," he said. The plan had been made. No one would have dared change it. This rigidity, this absolute commitment to predetermined plans regardless of circumstances, proved fatal. Japanese officers were not trained to adapt. They followed orders. When situations changed, they could not deviate without permission from superiors who were often miles away. The Americans were different. Marine officers were trained to use initiative. When one approach failed, they tried another. This flexibility created a defensive system the Japanese could not break. The October offensive failed completely. Japanese casualties numbered between 2,200 and 3,000 dead. American casualties were fewer than 300. The Sendai Division had been shattered. As 1942 drew to close, Guadalcanal had transformed into what Japanese soldiers bitterly called Starvation Island. The Tokyo Express, nightly destroyer runs bringing supplies, could not deliver enough. American control of Henderson Field meant transport ships could not approach during daylight without being destroyed. Japanese soldiers resorted to eating roots, grass, tree bark. They suffered malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and tropical diseases their medical system was unprepared to treat. Men who had been strong warriors became walking skeletons, too weak to fight or retreat. They developed their own grim survival metric. He who can rise to his feet has 30 days left to live. He who can sit up has 20 days left. He who must urinate lying down has 3 days. He who cannot speak has 2 days. He who cannot blink his eyes will be dead at dawn. They watched helplessly as American planes flew overhead. They saw American ships delivering supplies. They heard American artillery. And they knew everything their commanders had promised was a lie. By December, General Hyakutake was desperate. On December 23, he sent a message to Tokyo. "No food available and we can no longer send out scouts. We can do nothing to withstand enemy offensive. 17th Army requests permission to break into enemy positions and die honorable death rather than die of hunger in our own dugouts." The Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal in early February 1943. Over 3 nights, destroyers evacuated approximately 10,600 survivors. They left behind over 14,000 combat deaths and 9,000 who had perished from disease and starvation. For every American killed, nearly 10 Japanese died. Major General Kawaguchi, who had failed at Bloody Ridge, understood better than most what the losses meant. "Guadalcanal," he said after the war, "is the graveyard of the Japanese army." He was not exaggerating. The island had consumed Japan's finest units. The pilots and aircrew lost were irreplaceable. The ships sunk represented hemorrhage Japan could not sustain. But the most important loss was invisible. It was the destruction of a belief. Marines on Guadalcanal had proven something Japanese commanders believed impossible. Americans could fight. Americans could hold ground. Americans could match Japanese ferocity in close combat. The spiritual superiority supposed to guarantee victory did not exist. This realization spread through Japanese military establishment with devastating effect. In subsequent campaigns, Japanese commanders would face opponents who would not break, would not surrender, would not run. They could no longer assume aggressive attacks would cause collapse. They had to fight Americans as equals. And in that kind of fight, American industrial production and logistical superiority would prove decisive. Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor and later became the 18th Commandant of the Marine Corps, the first Marine to hold 4-star rank on active duty. Edson received the Medal of Honor for his defense of Bloody Ridge. Basilone became a national hero. When he received the Medal of Honor, he said something that captured the spirit of the Marines. "Only part of this medal belongs to me. Pieces belong to the boys still on Guadalcanal." He was offered commission and stateside posting. He turned them down and requested return to combat. On February 19, 1945, he was killed on the first day of the invasion of Iwo Jima while destroying a Japanese blockhouse and guiding a tank through a minefield. He posthumously received the Navy Cross, becoming the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both awards. The 1st Marine Division was so ravaged it had to be withdrawn for months of recovery. When declared combat ready, it fought at Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa. The word Guadalcanal appears on its shoulder patch to this day. But perhaps the most important legacy was invisible. It was the destruction of an idea. The belief that Japanese spiritual superiority could overcome any enemy had sustained Japanese confidence for decades. It had convinced planners they could fight and win against the United States despite vast disadvantages. Guadalcanal proved it false. The Marines did not win because they had better equipment. They did not win because of numerical superiority. They did not win because of overwhelming firepower. They won because they fought. They held ground when doctrine said they should not. They demonstrated that spiritual qualities Japanese commanders believed unique to themselves were present in equal measure on the other side. Japanese commanders who studied what happened began to understand the war would not end as planned. Americans would not negotiate. They would not sue for peace. They would fight island by island until Japan itself was threatened. Admiral Yamamoto had warned of this. In the first 6 to 12 months, he had said, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." Guadalcanal was where that prediction came true. Today, the battlefields are quiet. Jungle has reclaimed fighting positions. But memory remains. In the Marine Corps, Guadalcanal is sacred ground. Men who fought their established reputation that carries through every conflict since. And in Japan, though less remembered, significance is understood by those who study the war. Guadalcanal was where the tide turned. Where myth died. Where everything changed.